Chapter 1. The tall man in the poorly fitting gray suit looked about cautiously before he stepped out of the doorway. Down the long vista of street lights glimmering in the twilight haze, only a few pedestrians were visible. And none of them were near except the fellow who had obviously been celebrating too enthusiastically. The tall man's knees shook just a little as he stepped out into the open of the sidewalk. He felt the strength of steel springs in his muscles, but his hands felt naked. Empty. Without a knife. A cold wind blew along the street, blew up the open cuffs of trousers that were a good 3 inches too short for him. Trousers that obviously had been made to fit a shorter and heavier man. Up the thin legs of the tall man blew the wind, and it seemed to blow up along his spine, and he shivered. His somber eyes watched the celebrant, now only a few steps away. The fellow was a big man, with a thick bull-like neck. The tall man's fingers flexed. It would be easy, but, no, that way was not fast enough. People would come running. Policemen. Guards. And they would take him back. No. He thrust his hands into his pockets, telling himself that he must wait. He must use the cleverness that had enabled him to change, within the few hours since his escape, his uniform suit for the suit he now wore, less conspicuous despite its poor fit. And the man he had his eyes on had broad shoulders, too. He would put up a fight. Say, mister, the tall man whined, can you spare something for a guy who ain't eaten in days? Just some change, mister. Honest, The other men had stopped. He stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes owlish. He lifted a hand and solemnly waggled a thick finger at the suppliant. Can't fool me, he said. Can't fool fish. You want money by drinks, not eats. Drinks. You're bum. Mister. That ain't it. Honest. 'S good idea, drinks. Come on, I'll buy drinks. Your hat don't fit. I don't want. The tall man broke off abruptly, and his eyes grew crafty. Sure, mister. That's swell. But, some quiet place, huh? The way I'm dressed and all. The owl-eyed man who called himself Fish ponderously hooked an arm in the elbow of the man with the ill-fitting clothes. Sure. Quiet place. Come on, pal, we'll go see Joe. Say, that rhymes swell. Go, Joe. From time to time the tall man surreptitiously pulled at the sleeves of the gray coat to try to make them cover more of his bony wrists, to make himself less conspicuous. He pulled, too, at the brim of the too-tight hat, jamming it tightly down over his forehead. If it fit so badly that even this half-seas-over guy would notice. He thrust his hands back into his pockets. They felt less naked there. Gee, thanks, mister, he said. I dunno how I can ever. Here's Joe's, said his chance companion, and piloted the tall man through a doorway into a tavern. Behind the bar was a man even bigger than the celebrant, with a head as bald as the knob of a banister post. Otherwise, the place was deserted, too early for the evening crowd. The man in the ill-fitting clothes sighed audibly with relief. No other customers, what a break. Somewhere they would have. Hi, Fish, said the bald barman. Third time today. Going in circles around the block? Fish grinned. Give us a drink, Joe. Give my friend whatever he wants. Mine same as usual. You know, Joe, you got something there, about going in circles. Reed man's got one leg shorter in the other. Everybody. Makes you walk in circles. Like pinwheels maybe. Or, he talked on and on. The man in the ill-fitting clothes didn't like the way Joe was looking at him. He stepped quickly in closer to the bar and sat down on a stool, his hands out of sight in his lap. That kept his wrists and ankles from the bald man's suspicious stare. But the bartender didn't keep on looking at him. He put a shot glass on the bar and filled it from the Golden Eagle bottle, and shoved it across to Fish, without a chaser. Then he looked coldly at the slender man. Well, bum? He asked. The man in the poorly fitting clothes felt relief. If he was passing for an ordinary moocher, he had 33 cleared the first hurdle. A beer, I guess, he said. But could I get something to eat first? Give him anything he wants, Joe, said Fish magnanimously. Maybe the guy is hungry. I thought he just had a thirst. Someday, maybe I'll be where he is, Joe. Maybe you will. Never can tell. He picked up handling ain't my detail, anywho. Now, Joe, you give this here guy whatever he wants. I'm paying for it, see? Okay, Fish, okay. I'll take care of him. The big bartender tapped the slender man on the shoulder. Come on, bum. I'll give you some his glass and downed its contents. That's why I never turn a guy down, Joe, when I'm off duty. Luckily for the tall man, the bartender had been looking at Fish and Fish had been looking at nothing. Neither of them saw the tall man start suddenly. Off duty? He said. Are you? Sure, pal, I'm a detective. But don't let it worry you. I got 3 days off and I'm celebrating. Pang grub in the back room and leave you there to eat it. Then you scram, see? You don't look, well, you eat and then scram. The tall man nodded, and followed the bartender into the back room. There was a kitchen table there, and chairs around it. The bartender put a plate of bread on the table, a smaller plate with some sliced sausage beside it. He turned toward the icebox in one corner, then reconsidered. That'll do you, he said. Go ahead. Gee, thanks. That's swell. The tall man sat down at the table and reached for a slice of bread. Then he froze in that position, motionless, as the bartender turned away and went back to the front room again. He dropped the bread back on the plate, and pushed the chair back quietly so it wouldn't scrape. His eyes searched the kitchen eagerly. There would be a knife somewhere, surely. Where? His breath was coming fast now, with the nearness of it. The icebox? Not so likely. The cupboard? Then, as he stood up, he saw the drawer of the table at which he had been sitting. His somber eyes lighted. With infinite caution, half an inch at a time, he slid the drawer open. It was there. His whole body trembled, not with fear, as he reached into the drawer and picked up the knife. His hand closed around the hilt of it, and his hand was no longer naked. Back in the barroom, the world revolved around Fish in pink and black circles. The pink circles were the present, and the black circles were the future. Oh, not that there was anything violently wrong about the future, past tomorrow morning. But tomorrow morning he would have a hangover, and it would be a dilly. Fish knew that, though Fish didn't drink often. This was the first celebration he'd had since years ago. Here he had a rare 3 days off, and because he had done all his celebrating the first day, the second and third days were going to be misery. Anyway, the second. Something was pounding at his ears. The radio back of the bar. Where was Joe? Oh, yes. He swiveled around on the stool and yelled at the kitchen door, Hey, Joe, how's about shutting off this blinkin' yell box? He got up off the stool to go around and shut it off himself, but decided it was too much trouble. Pretty soon he'd better take a taxi home and go to sleep. That voice on the radio, it sounded exactly like old Cap Mollenauer, who used to handle the radio car broadcasts when he, Fish, used to be in a radio flavor. But Cap Mollenauer was dead now. The Alki gang, they thought, had rubbed him out. But they had never proved who did it, and Cap Mollenauer had been a swell guy, too. Fish cursed the Alki gang, then cursed the radio. He gripped the glass that had held the Golden Eagle and wondered if he could throw it straight enough to put the radio out of commission. But he was a force of law and order, on duty or off. He couldn't go throwing glassware around taverns. And now for the local news, went on Cap Mollenauer, only Cap Mollenauer was dead, so this must be someone else who had a voice like Cap's. Carl Landers, the homicidal maniac who escaped late this afternoon from Bellevue Asylum, is still at large. Everyone in the city is urged to take extraordinary precautions. He has been seen, or reported seen, in several places, and the police are active in investigating all leads. They hope to have him in custody within a matter of hours. He is described as nuts, said Fish, glad that he was off duty and not chasing a homie with the rest of the boys. Carl Landers, oh, yes. He had been arrested 3-4 years ago after those Blake Street killings, the nice ones with the knife. Fish thought, maybe he ought to phone in and ask if there was anything he could do to help in the hunt. He stood up again, but the very movement made him decide he'd better not phone headquarters. Heck, he was off duty, anyway, and they could get along without him, he hoped. Chapter 2. Fish wakes up. The outer door opened. Fish turned to see who had entered the saloon. He frowned. It couldn't have been anyone he wanted to see less. For it was Jerry Craven, reporter for the newspaper that habitually lambasted the force and yowled for reform, their idea of reform being their own party in power. Craven grinned. Well, if it isn't Mortimer Fish, and high as a kite. How's the rest of the force? Fish glowered at the newspaper man. It was a good thing that a few drinks didn't make Fish pugnacious, or he would have taken a poke at Craven's smug puss just for having the crust to call him Mortimer. Yes, That was the name his parents had misguidedly given him, but that was a long time ago and he had lived it down, except for the records. "Listen, you," he said. "Hi, Joe," said Craven, turning his head. "What have you been feeding the police force?" Then as his eyes lit on the bottle on the bar. "Golden Eagle? Make mine the same, and fill up Fish's." The bald bartender went behind the bar again, and set another glass on it. "Sure, Mr. Craven. Water wash?" "Not any for me, Joe," said Fish. "I wouldn't drink with that punk if." Joe grinned and filled Fish's glass anyway. "Make the drinks on me, then, so you two can bury the hatchet," he said. "In my head," said Fish. "That's where he'll bury it. With an article on." "No, he won't, Fish," said Joe pacifically. "You're off duty, ain't you? So you got a right." "Sure, Fish," affirmed Craven. "I'm off duty, too, incidentally, and am I not tarring myself with the same brush? Ah, and a very good brush it is. Now if all tavern owners were like Joe Hummer here and didn't refill their bottles with bootleg the minute they get down past the halfway mark." "There ain't any halfway mark on a whiskey bottle," said Fish. "But, yeah, if all tavern keepers were like Joe here, then that yella newspaper of yours wouldn't have anything to squawk about. Anyway, we've been trying to tell you, bootleg alky's not in the department of the city police. It belongs to." Sure. Revenue. But how about the crimes it leads to? How about the guys this Cranston ring has bumped off because they wouldn't play ball? Murder's your department, no matter why it. "Aw, go lay an egg," said Fish. "There've been 3 unsolved killings that might have been the Cranston mob, but nobody can prove it. Not even the Blade, Craven. And when one of them was one of our own men, if you think we didn't try." Sure, said Craven. "Now that that's off your chest, will you have one on me?" "Well," said Fish. "Special bulletin," said the radio as a jazz band came to the end of a downbeat. "Carl Landers, the escaped homicidal maniac, is reported to have been seen near 6th and Wabash half an hour ago. He wore, at that time, a gray suit and a hat, both of which were too small for him. Apparently he has been able to X-36 change the uniform in which he escaped for civilian garb. Police are closing in on the district surrounding 6th and Wabash. People living near there are advised to keep doors and windows locked, and not to answer any." "Say," said Joe. "That's near here." Something seemed to explode inside Fish's head. "Good tripe," he said. "That guy I brought in." He and Joe looked at each other. "What guy?" Craven wanted to know. "Got your gun, Fish?" Joe asked. Fish shook his head, already sliding off the stool and wishing he'd had just one drink less. Joe yanked a drawer open somewhere behind the bar and came out with a short-barreled heavy revolver in his hand, and a scowl on his face. He and Fish made for the door to the back room almost abreast. The door was ajar, but from the barroom all that could be seen was a table. "Hey!" called the reporter. "What goes on?" "Let me in on." That was when they heard the scream. It came from somewhere quite a distance away, but it was a piercing feminine shriek that cut the air like a knife. It hung for an instant on high E, then choked off abruptly. The kitchen was empty. The door at the back of it leading to the quarters behind the tavern stood open. "Good gosh," said Joe. "I thought that was locked." Fish, now in the lead, plowed on through into the rooms beyond. There were 2 of them, and they were empty. The door at the back of the second room, leading to a small cement-paved yard, stood wide open. Joe caught up the headquarters detective and grabbed his arm as they reached the yard. "Take it easy, guy," he said. "You ain't got a gun, and this ain't no picnic. If that was the nut, well, there were knives in that room." "Sure," said Fish. "A knife, of course. That was what the guy was after. That was why he had wanted to eat instead of drink. He wouldn't be hungry yet if he had escaped only late in the afternoon, not hungry enough anyway to risk bumming a meal." "Lord, what a sap I was." Fish groaned. There was a light half a block down the alley, a pale yellow spot in the gray dusk. 2 houses down the alley toward the light lay the sprawled bodies of 2 men. Each lay in the center of a dark sticky pot L that seemed to be still spreading. Fish got almost to them, then grabbed the top of a fence to hold on. He felt sick, physically and mentally. He heard Craven's voice behind him. "Where's the woman who screamed? There'll be another body, in a yard or house or..." "Shut up," said Fish. He didn't want to think about that possibility. Joe, go phone the station. I'll look. Hey, gimme. He grabbed the revolver out of the tavern keeper's hand and started running up the alley toward the light, around and past the corpses of the men. Up there at the other end of the alley, past the yellow light, he had caught sight of a moving figure. The sheer forward momentum of Fish's pistoning legs kept him erect for a while. Then the curb on the left came too close and got under Fish's feet and tripped him. The corner of a garage came straight for his face. It was like a slow-motion dream of flying. He tried to throw up a hand to ward it off, but the corner post of the garage came faster than his hand could move. It got larger and larger until it filled his whole field of vision, and his hand had hardly moved yet. Then a red flash, into blackness. 37T. He nurse looked down and saw that Fish's eyes were open between the bandage across his forehead and the thicker bandage across his nose. "A Captain Bradwell to see you, Mr. Fish," she said. "Do you feel well enough to see him?" "Arg," said Fish, looking at her somberly. It was hardly a courteous affirmative, nor even a courteous negative for that matter. The nurse was a good-looking one, too, with bright red hair and a smile. From the smile, Fish decided she didn't know anything about him or who he was. He'd had his eyes open for half an hour now and they were just beginning to focus properly. His head felt as if it had been used as a concrete mixer and his mouth felt like the inside of a sewer after a long dry spell. He didn't want to see anybody. He didn't even want his own company. In fact, he particularly did not want himself around, but there didn't seem to be anything he could do about that. "I beg your pardon?" said the nurse brightly. Said Fish. "Aw, send him in. Might as well get it over with." He tried to turn his head, and wished he hadn't. "Hey, wait a minute. First tell me what's all wrong with me." But the nurse had already left. While he waited, Fish experimentally flexed his arms a bit, then his legs. Nothing seemed to hurt as long as he didn't move his head. He ran cautiously exploring hands along his ribs, and they seemed to be intact. Then, gently, he raised his hands to his face. Most of it was covered with bandages. His chin stuck out the bottom and seemed to work all right on its hinges, but there wasn't any doubt about his nose being broken. There was plaster under the bandage across it. As far as he could tell with his tongue, all his teeth seemed to be there. Footsteps beside the bed made him look up. Big, red-faced Captain Bradwell stood there looking down at him. His eyes didn't look any too friendly. "The conquering hero," he said. "Hi, Cap," said Fish.
"Yeah, I guess I did pull a boner all right.
But I hadn't seen a paper or anything, so I didn't know there was a homie on the, get him yet?" "Not a smell of him." Fish groaned. "How many, so far?" "Just the two. He must be holed up somewhere till it cools down." "Just two, Cap? How about the woman who screamed? Didn't she?" "Nope. Turned out she didn't see Landers. She screamed when she came across the bodies, taking a short cut home from the store through the alley. She ran on in a building and up to her flat." Said Fish. "Who were the guys?" "One wasn't much loss," said Bradwell. "Bud Miller, used to be a Cranston mobster. You remember him, I guess. Other chap, his name was Randall, was a grocer, had his store there." "Bud Miller," said Fish wonderingly. "What was he doing there?" Captain looked irritated. "What's it matter? It's a public alley. There are a couple of taverns there with back entrances on it." "Did you check him yet?" "No. Why should we? What do we care what he was doing in the alley?" "I dunno," Fish admitted. "Guess I'm still going in circles. What's wrong with me, besides a broken smeller?" "Bruises and contusions," said Bradwell. "And a suspension." "Hey. I wasn't on duty, Cap. On my own time I got a right to, well, anyway, I don't drink anything often, do I? And I could name a few of the boys who do a lot oftener than, so could I," cut in Captain Burr 38-ton dryly. "But they don't buy drinks for homicidal maniacs on the loose." "But how'd I know? Skip it. How long's the suspension?" "There'll be a hearing before the board, tomorrow morning at 10. You ought to be out of here by then. If not, we give you a postponement," Fish sighed. Okay. But say, a hearing's usually pretty serious stuff, isn't it?" "It usually is," said Bradwell. "I have a hunch this one won't be an exception, Fish. Well, I got to go now. Don't worry about it, until you read the papers." Fish lay there staring at the ceiling, after Bradwell had left. Finally, he reached over and got a cord with a buzzer button on the end of it. He pushed the button and nothing happened. After half a minute he pushed it again. And when nothing continued to happen, he held the button down steadily until the nurse appeared in the doorway. "Yes, Mr. Fish?" she asked. "Will you get me a paper? This morning's Blade?" "Just a minute. There'll be one in the waiting room, unless someone's thrown it away already. But the evening papers will be out soon. Wouldn't you just as soon wait until?" It's the Blade I want to see in particular." Chapter 3. Trouble at Twilight Isle. The nurse was gone. Fish experimented with his neck, and found he could turn his head. Encouraged, he raised himself to a sitting position and propped the pillow on end against the head of the bed, to be in a better position for reading. He decided that he probably would live, after all. The pain from his nose was only a dull throb that could be ignored, and the headache was merely a matter of time. A copy of the Blade, rather the worse for wear and with the sections out of order, was put in his lap by the nurse. "Anything else I can bring you?" she asked brightly. "Naw," said Fish. "I mean, no, thanks. Unless maybe I better have an anesthetic while I read about, skip it." I was kidding. The sports section was on top, with a headline about a 14-inning tie between the Reds and the Giants. He put it regretfully aside, and hunted out the front page. The main banner head was by Mars Out of Europe, but the Landers case story was not hard to find. It was topped by a 4-column head, Homicidal Maniac Still at Large Slays 2 in Downtown Alley, and the 3-column subhead in 24-point Gaudy bold, Headquarters Detective Gives Killer Access to Lethal Weapon. Fish winced a little. He closed his eyes and opened them, and the subhead was still there. Maybe he should have asked the redhead for an anesthetic to go with the newspaper. Well, the story itself couldn't be any worse than the heading, so he read on. Carl Landers, 37, homicidal maniac who escaped at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon from Bellevue Asylum, killed 2 men last night at about 7:40 p.m. and is still at large. The victims were Walter, Bud, Miller, 35, of 115 Beecher Street, and H.J. Randall, 44, grocer, of 330 Corey Street. Both killings took place in the alley between Corey and Main Streets, at a point approximately behind the grocery store and living quarters of Randall. A knife, presumably one stolen from the back room of the Tavern of Joe Hummer, 324 Corey Street, was the weapon used by the homicidal killer. "Ha," said Fish. "Homicidal 39 killer. That guy Craven needs lessons in English." The bodies were first seen by Mrs. E. Sanders, who lives on the second floor at 334 Corey Street. She screamed and ran upstairs to phone the police. Her screams aroused the attention of. Fish's eyes skipped down a few lines and caught the subhead in minion bold. Police Detective aids maniac. He gritted his teeth and read on from there. The maniac was unwittingly aided by Mortimer Fish, 41, headquarters detective. Fish, who was in an exhilarated condition, had been accosted in Corey Street, shortly prior to the murders, by Carl Landers, who posed as a panhandler asking for money. Instead of taking Landers in charge for begging, which was the detective's duty as a public officer, even though he was not on duty at the time, Fish took him into the Tavern of Joe Hummer, and instructed Hummer, here was more of it, much more. That was just the start, and it got worse. Much worse. Fish had read it through twice and was staring at a hole in the wall by the foot of his bed when the nurse came back. "How do you feel, Mr. Fish?" she asked. Fish looked at her suspiciously. "Swell," he said. "Why?" "I was wondering if you'd read the editorial page, too." "Huh?" said Fish, and glowered at her. "What's it to you, anyway?" "Nothing, but..." "But what?" "It's none of my business, of course. But if you just read that article, you're feeling very sorry for yourself, aren't you?" "Well, sure you are. I don't blame you, in a way. It was sheer bad luck. You might take a few drinks 1,000. The match caught the gleam of the knife that lashed out at Fish's stomach 40 times, and nothing like that would." "I haven't taken a few drinks 1,000 times, said Fish. "That was the first time in years. And, of all the people in town, he had to go and pick me." "That's what I mean," said the red-headed nurse. "You're still sorry for yourself. If you read that editorial, you might get mad and do something about it." "Do what?" "Maybe find Carl Landers, before he kills anyone else." "How?" "The newspaper said you were a detective." "But listen," said Fish. "The whole department's after him. An organized search. What could I do?" "I don't know. I merely suggested that you might read that editorial about yourself. Maybe you'd find it funny, or maybe..." Okay, said Fish. He began to look through the disordered newspaper. He heard the door close, just as he found the editorial in question. He read the first half of it only. It was twilight again when Fish left the hospital, and as he walked down the street there was a tendency, at first, for him to wobble and to weep from one side of the walk to the other. But by the time he had gone a dozen blocks and was nearing the vicinity of Corey and 3rd Streets, Fish got that straightened out. He was pretty well straightened out about what he was going to do, too, although there were a lot of ifs to that. What the second step would be depended on where the first took him, and the third depended on the second. Yeah, naturally. He was going to do the unnatural thing for a case like this by conducting a natural investigation. That was the one thing which, according to what Cap Bradwell had said, the police had not done. Undoubtedly, they had drawn a beautiful dragnet, and undoubtedly they had every available radio car at a strategic spot ready to investigate reports of a tall, thin man in ill-fitting clothes seen at such and such a place. And probably, with every housewife in the city scared stiff, there were plenty of such reports for them to investigate. But there was one thing they had not done, apparently. They had assumed, undoubtedly correctly, that the crimes were the motiveless slayings of a homie on the loose. And that once he had committed them, he had lambed out, and only a fortune-teller could guess where he would strike again. Sure, that was right. But and it was the only. But which gave Fish a chance to work off what that editorial had done to him. They had probably ignored the very things that are strictly routine on any other murder case. They had not checked up on the scene of the crime, and the witnesses, and probably they had not bothered to check what the victims were doing at that time and place. Of course, if this Randall guy lived there and ran a grocery there, that would not be hard to explain. But Bud Miller didn't live there. What had he been doing there? And what, another part of Fish's mind wanted to know, did it matter what he was doing there? How could it help to find where this Carl Landers was now? Shut up, said Fish, to that questioning voice in his mind. If he took that attitude, he had no way to start in on things. He might as well wander about the streets at random, hoping for lightning to strike him. What if he couldn't see what things like that had to do with finding Landers? Heck, 9/10 of the time there didn't seem to be any reason for going through the routine steps in solving a crime, until suddenly you asked an ordinary question and got an answer you didn't expect. It was almost 24 hours after what happened 23 hours ago. 15 hours before 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. But 15 hours from now would be time enough to think about that. Let's see. It had been right about here that the guy had come up to him and bummed him for money. Had he seen the guy before that? Fish stood there, thinking, forcing his mind back through what seemed to be heavy fog. Sure, he remembered now. The thin man stepped out of that very doorway. Fish walked up to the door. It was locked, and there was a store for rent sign behind the glass panel. Well, it was 1,000,000 to 1 shot, but he couldn't overlook even that odds on a bet. He took a ring of skeleton keys out of his pocket and found one that opened the door. He looked in, using his flashlight, and saw he need not have been suspicious. Dust was thick on the floor, and it had not been disturbed in weeks. Landers had not been in there, before or after. He had merely waited in the doorway for a sucker to come along. Fish strolled on slowly, thinking. A Mrs. Sanders, 2nd floor at 334 Corey, a few doors down from Joe's, had, according to the newspaper account, discovered the bodies, and had screamed before she ran in to phone for the police. That scream had been what had sent him and Hummer and Craven out into the alley. Fish turned in at number 334 and climbed a flight of steps to the 2nd floor. He rapped on the door at the head of the stairs. Footsteps approached the inside of the door. "Who's there?" A woman's voice called. "Headquarters detective," said Fish. "Are you Mrs. Sanders? Just want to ask you a few questions, about last night."
My husband isn't here. I can't open the door."
"The papers and the radio tell us not to open unless we know." "Sure," said Fish. "Wait a minute." He took his identification card out of his wallet and slid it under the door. It was pulled on inward, and in a moment the door opened. Fish took back the card and leaned against the doorpost as he replaced it in his wallet. "Will you tell me just how you happened to discover the bodies, Mrs. Sanders?" "Why, sure, but," she looked at him, not so much suspicious this time as curious. "But 4 times I told the whole story. To your Mr. Bradwell, and to," Fish nodded. "Yes, of course. But Captain Bradwell was taken off the case, and I wanted to hear your story myself. Of course, he told me most of it before they took him away, but..." "Took him away?" Why, what? Oh, nothing serious, Mrs. Sanders. Appendicitis. But they operated right away and got it in time. So, if you don't mind running over the story once more, obviously, Mrs. Sanders didn't mind at all. And obviously she had told the story a great deal more often than 4 times. That number, of course, had not counted friends and neighbors. And, like a snowball rolling downhill, the story had gained length with each telling. Her reasons for having returned from the store, and which store it was and all she had purchased, seemed to go back almost to the time she had married Sanders. And Sanders was a window cleaner by trade and she always worried for fear he would fall. Even that fact was woven into the story. But Fish listened patiently, and learned nothing of importance. He leaned for a while against the other side of the doorway, and then back where he had been, and wished he had gone in and sat down to listen. Finally the torrent of words slowed down. "Ah, thanks," he said. "I guess that's about all I need to know. You, told it so well, you didn't leave any questions for me to ask." He took a step backward and started to turn. Then he said, "Oh, by the way. You said you told your story 4 times. Who did you tell besides Captain Bradwell?" "Oh, the other 3 were reporters. They were the ones that were really interested. Mr. Bradwell just wanted to know whether I'd seen which way the killer ran, and I hadn't seen him at all. I had a hard time making Mr. Bradwell listen. But the other 3 men were nice. One was a Mr. Craven from the Blade, and the other 2 from the Sentinel." "2 from the Sentinel? Did they come together?" "No, of course not, or you wouldn't have said 4 times you told the story. But why did the Sentinel send 2 men?" She looked at him, her eyes a bit puzzled. "You know, I never thought to ask." "Well, maybe the explanation is something like your case. I mean, the police sending 2 men." Said Fish. "It might be interesting if it was. Do you recall their names?" "The first was, I believe his name was Doyle or something like that. Not very tall, and wore thick glasses." "Doyle," said Fish. "I know him." "The other?" "He called late this afternoon. His name, I believe it was Wrigley." "Yes, I'm sure it was. Walter Wrigley." "I can't quite place him," said Fish honestly. "I thought I knew all the Sentinel's leg men." "What did he look like?" "Well, I'd say he was about 30. About your height, no, a little less. But he was stockily built, weighed almost as much as you do. Kind of a yellowish complexion. I didn't notice the color of his eyes. But he had dark hair, and kind of bushy eyebrows. He wore a dark brown suit, and I think a yellow shirt. That's what made me notice his complexion. I guess that's all I can remember." "You've got a swell memory," said Fish. "Did he show you any credentials? I suppose he did, though, or you wouldn't have let him in."
I don't believe he did," Mrs. Sanders said thoughtfully.
"I was sweeping the stairs when he came, so there just wasn't any question of opening the door for him, and I don't believe I asked for credentials. I could see right away that he didn't look anything like those descriptions of this Carl Landers. And, anyway, he looked familiar. I think I've seen him around." "Around here? Nearby?" "I think so." "Say, you don't mean you think that he wasn't what he said he was, or that he was dangerous?" "Not at all, ma'am, not at all," said Fish. "I just thought I knew all the reporters in town and I was trying to place him. But just the same, you stick to that idea of yours of not opening the door unless you know who's there. It's a good idea. Well, thanks lots." Chapter 4. Fish Williams walked down the stairs more slowly and thoughtfully than he had gone up them, and when he went into Joe Hummer's tavern he merely waved at Joe and crossed to the telephone on the wall. He dialed the number of the Sentinel, and asked to talk to Walter Wrigley. "Sorry," said the operator. "We have no Mr. Wrigley here." "He works days," said Fish. "I didn't think I'd catch him there now, but maybe you can tell me how I can reach him." "We have no Walter Wrigley here, sir. Day or night. There's a Mr. William Wrigley in circulation. He's not here now, but—" "I could have got the first name wrong," said Fish. "Is this William Wrigley a stockily built dark-haired man of about 30? "No, sir. He's quite an elderly gentleman. I have a list of all employees here, and there is no—" "Listen, Fish," Joe said. "I read that Blade business, and I wouldn't blame you if you're sore at Craven. But he'll probably be in here in a few minutes and, well, don't start any trouble, will you?" "He'll be in here? How come?" "I mean he probably will. He eats downtown after work, his shift ends at 6:30, and generally drops in here for a few minutes on his way home, see? About this time, like last night. But listen, if you pop him one it'll just make things worse. Okay, said Fish. There's the door now. Is it? Joe glanced up. Yeah, he said. Hello, Mr. Craven. Hi, Joe, Fish. The reporter found one corpse. Attorney John Massey is plunged into a savage melee of blackmail and death when he goes to the aid of a pretty girl motorist, and discovers a dead man in her automobile. Guess I just made a mistake, sister. Never mind, and thanks. He put the receiver back on the hook and walked over to the bar. Fish, said Joe. You look like something the cat dragged in. Have a drink? Sure. Lemon soda, unless you got some coffee hot, maybe. Got coffee? With or without? Black. Say, this is about the time I was in here last night. Maybe the same news program's on. Turn on the radio, Joe. I want to see if there's anything new on Landers. Joe nodded and flipped the switch before he went back after the coffee. The European news was still on when he came back with it. Came on up to the bar, not too confidently. Say, Fish, I hope you don't think there was anything personal in that article. I didn't. Sure, said Fish. Shut up. I want you to know I didn't write that editorial. Shut up, I said, Fish snapped. I want to catch this broadcast. He missed the first words. The voice on the radio was just saying. Are still searching for Carl Landers, the escaped maniac who killed 2 men last night. The activities see the police department are under severe criticism by. Shut it off, Joe, said Fish. Just wanted to be sure nothing new had come in. Listen, you, too, Craven. I wasn't exactly myself last night. Were there any angles you know of that got overlooked, maybe? Craven looked at him curiously. What do you mean, angles? You sound like you got something, Fish, Joe said. Give. Fish shook his head slowly. Well, maybe I got something, but I don't know what it is. Listen, do you know anyone fits this? About 5 feet 9 or 10, heavily built, sallow skin, dark hair and bushy eyebrows. Yesterday he wore a dark brown suit and yellow shirt. Might be a newspaper man or might not. Joe's eyes widened. What could another guy have to do with this Landers? Another nut or something? That's silly. Yeah, Fish admitted. But do you know a guy like I described? Or you, Craven? Said Craven. No newspaper man, Fish. Unless Ronson of the Sentinel. No, you wouldn't call his eyebrows bushy, and anyway I saw him yesterday and he wore blue serge. But, say, how about Hank Whitman? Fish whistled. Then he drained the last of his coffee and stood up. Hey, said Joe. Let us in on it. What could Hank Whitman have to do with Carl Landers? I haven't an idea, Fish told him. But I hanker to know. You mean a guy described like that was seen around here or something yesterday? But how would that tie him in with a homie killing a couple people? Fish grinned. I was kidding you, Toe. It wasn't yesterday. It was today, this afternoon. But there haven't been any murders today. Not yet, said Fish. He went out, leaving them staring at him. It had been a nice exit, Fish realized as he reached the sidewalk, but it would have been less spectacular if Joe and Craven had known that he didn't really know a thing. He wasn't even guessing yet. He was merely trying to guess. And there didn't seem to be even an intelligent guess that would tie up Carl Landers and Hank Whitman, except through Bud Miller, one of the men Landers had killed. Hank Whitman, and that was the reason Fish had whistled, was Bud Miller's pal. Both members, or they had been not so long ago, of the Cranston mob. All right, where did that get him? A homicidal maniac, who was not and never had been a criminal in the ordinary sense of the word, who could not possibly be tied up with gangsters, had escaped from an asylum. Thus far he had killed 2 men, one of whom was a Cranston gangster. The other was a grocer. And where would a grocer fit in? Fish swore and began to walk slower so that, he hoped, he could think better. What did it matter that the other guy was a grocer, or that Miller was a crook? A homicidal maniac didn't ask questions or care whom he killed, did he? But then why had Hank Whitman gone to see Mrs. Sanders this afternoon, posing as a reporter in order to question her? Maybe it hadn't been Hank Whitman. That description was general enough to fit quite a few guys, of course. But if it wasn't Whitman, then Fish didn't have a lead. Yes, for the sake of seeing where it got him, he would assume that Whitman had called on Mrs. Sanders. Where did that get him? Nowhere. Except that his feet were taking him in the direction of the garage where he kept his car, and the only reason he could have for wanting that car would be to drive out to the Green Dragon, where one would be most likely to run into Cranston. Or Hank 45 Whitman. And most likely to run into trouble. If he tried arresting or questioning people without knowing even what questions he wanted to ask them. Hen, he laughed. Trouble? He couldn't be in any worse truehole, short of occupancy of a slab at the morgue, than he was in right now, could he? He began to walk faster. But by the time he had driven the car out of the garage, he realized that it was still a bit early for the Green Dragon. He drove slowly and roundabout, thinking. The thinking, too, was slow and roundabout. If Hank Whitman had impersonated a reporter to question the woman who had discovered the bodies of Miller and Randall, then it meant there was something fishy. But what? It was absurd to think of a tie-up between Carl Landers and the Alki ring. Could it be that? But no, there was no doubt about the identity of the tall man he, Fish, had taken into Joe Hummers to buy a drink. There had been a picture of Carl Landers in the Blade, and there wasn't any doubt about identity. The doorman at the Green Dragon did not recognize Fish at first. Then he grinned as though the plaster cast on the detective's nose was funnier than Charlie Chaplin. If you like it that much, Fish said. Maybe I could arrange for you to have one too. Is your best customer here? The doorman pretended not to understand. Who? He wanted to know. Fish glowered at him, and walked on in. He stopped at the cigar counter and took his time about buying cigarettes and lighting one of them. He knew Goldoni was there. His car had been outside across the street. And there was a communicator that the doorman could use in talking to the barman in the main room at the rear. The doorman had understood him all right, and he would phone back that a man from headquarters was looking for Cranston. And if Cranston made himself scarce, it might mean that he didn't want to be found, that he had something on what would be his conscience if he had one. That would tell Fish something, even if he didn't know what. And if Cranston scrammed, well, there wasn't anything Fish was ready to ask him anyway. Maybe there would be after he had seen Whitman. But Cranston, dapper and supercilious as ever, was lounging against the bar. He turned, as Fish walked in, and smiled with his lips. Ah, he said. The conquering hero, with the scars of battle. Fish walked on past him without a word or a glance and opened the door to the room behind the bar. Nothing he could have said to Cranston, he knew, would get his goat as much as completely ignoring him. It was imagination, of course, but he thought he could feel the cold, angry stare of Cranston on the back of his neck. There were 4 men sitting around a card table in the back room, one of them Hank Whitman. The game had just started, apparently, and was being played desultorily for small stakes until more players, suckers preferred, should join the game. Fish ignored the others. Hello, Whitman, he said. Want to talk to you. Whitman was wearing, Fish noticed, a dark brown suit and a shirt that was almost yellow. Whitman glanced up at Fish insolently, then turned back to the game, lifting up the corner of the whole card he had just been dealt and leaning backward to peer at its underside. Go ahead, he said. I can listen while I play. Not here, said Fish. Down at the station. Some of the other boys 46 have questions to ask you, too. You wouldn't mean this is an arrest? That's just what I would mean. Tee-hee dealer, with an ace up, tossed in a red chip. Too much, Whitman said, and turned down his up card. Then he looked at Fish again. What for? Suspicion, Fish told him. Suspicion of anything you want to be suspected of. Want to come along willingly? I'd just as soon you didn't myself. He heard footsteps and knew that Cranston had left the bar and come over to the doorway. Looking for trouble, copper? Cranston's soft voice said. I'd love it, said Fish, without turning. Cranston chuckled. Go with the guy, Hank, he said. He hasn't got anything on us. And I'll have a mouthpiece there by the time you get there. He can't hold you. Thanks, boys, Fish said. That's too swell of you. He stepped backward and his heel came down on the pointed toe of Cranston's shoe. Oops, sorry, Fish said, but he threw his weight the wrong way for an instant before he recovered his balance and stepped sideward. Cranston's face was white as Fish jerked around to face him, and his hand had gone, almost as though unconsciously, toward his lapel. But Fish's own hand was already inside his coat, and Cranston's froze where it was, then dropped. But his thin, white face looked like a devil mask. Curse you, copper, he said. Fish grinned. I am an awkward lummox, ain't I? Even the newspapers think so. Ready, Whitman, or shall I? The sallow-complexioned man stood up and put his chips into his coat pocket. I'll keep these, boys, he said. Back in an hour or two. Hold my seat. He strolled toward Fish. If you got a heater, better park it, Fish said. The boys at headquarters might not like your carrying one. They're funny that way. Deliberately he turned his back on both Whitman and Cranston and started for the door. But he took only 2 steps, then stopped and waited. Those 2 steps brought him to a point where he could see behind him in the glass of a picture that hung on the wall beside the door. It was not a mirror, but the picture was a glossy print and the light shone on it diagonally. In the glass, he could see both men. No gun exchanged hands as Whitman passed his chief. Apparently Whitman was not packing one. But his hand darted to the breast pocket of his coat and flipped out a small leather-bound notebook. Cranston took it and slid it into his own pocket. Fish let it go. That notebook would be some addresses of customers of the Alki ring, but the police knew most of them already. It would not be proof of anything, and anyway Fish was not interested in Alki tonight. Not unless he could find out how, if at all, Alki without tax concerned Carl Landers. At the door he turned and said, "Don't count on getting him back too soon, Cranston. It's tough to get habeas corpus on a murder rap." He watched Cranston's face, and Whitman's for reaction. But there was not a sign of anything except bewilderment, and possibly a bit of relief. And both looked genuine, but you couldn't tell. Whitman grinned. "I'll phone and let you know who I'm supposed to have murdered, Chief," he said. "So long." Before Fish got into the car, he frisked Whitman to be sure about a gun. Whitman was not healed. Fish headed the car toward 3rd and Corey Streets. If there was a light showing at the Sanders place, he would take Whitman up there and get Mrs. Sanders to identify him as her caller of the afternoon. Then it would be tougher for Whitman to wriggle out of explaining. He swung the car in at the curb in front of Joe Hummer's. If the Sanders place was dark, Fish had another idea that involved the use of Joe's telephone. He was still working in the dark, and maybe hunting in the dark for a black cat that was not there, but he had a hunch something might happen if he kept throwing monkey wrenches into the machinery. One monkey wrench would be the fact that Whitman, whether or not he talked, would not show up anymore tonight, either back at the Green Dragon or at headquarters where a mouthpiece would be waiting to spring him. "You're waiting for me a minute here, Hank," Fish said. "And just to keep you from getting ideas." He took out his handcuffs and snapped one of them around Whitman's left wrist, the other to the steering post. "What the devil are we doing here?" Whitman demanded. "Don't tell me you're going to leave me here and go in there to get tanked up." Fish grinned at him, but didn't answer. He got out of the car and walked up to 334 Corey, and into the areaway alongside the building. There wasn't any light on the 2nd floor. He mumbled something, and went up and rang the bell anyway. After a couple of minutes a small, wiry Italian with curly black hair came to the door, dressed in an old bathrobe. He was about half the size of the woman Fish had talked to. "Mr. Sanders?" Fish asked, and showed his badge. "Police. Awful sorry if you have to wake your wife, but I'd like her to identify someone I have in the car. I'll bring him up, when she's ready." The wiry little man shook his head. "Elda, she's not here. She's very upset about finding those men stabbed. I sent her spend a few days with her sister in Buffalo. She no feel good." Humph, thought Fish, she had pulled a fast one to wangle herself a vacation. She had enjoyed the excitement and having something to talk about. She feel swell. But if she was gone, that was that. "Well," he said. "Sorry if I waked you up. But who you went her to see? She no see guy who stabbed." "Nah, I know that," Fish said. "Another guy, one who came here to talk to her today. Said he was a reporter and gave her a phony name." "So? For what?" "I dunno, yet," admitted Fish. "Maybe you could guess?" The wiry little man shook his head slowly. "But," he said helpfully, "if he talk to my Elda and tell her he's, say, I go down and punch his face and make him tell why he," Fish grinned. "Thanks, but I've thought of that myself. I can handle it." He turned away, then remembered the monkey wrench policy. "The guy," he said, "is a member of Cranston's mob. That suggest anything?" Again Sanders shook his head slowly. "No. But then maybe it's a not so good idea to punch his face," Fish laughed. "It's still a good idea. Well, so long, and thanks." He shouldn't, he realized, have mentioned the Cranston angle. Now, if it came to a point of Mrs. Sanders having to identify Whitman, he would have to get in touch with her somehow before her husband saw her. Obviously, the Italian had a normal fear of getting in wrong with gangsters and would advise his wife not to stick her neck out. But Sanders's reaction had been 48 natural. He had not pretended not to know who the gangster was, nor given any other cause to be suspected. Chapter 5. Business was picking up in Joe Hummer's tavern. Craven was still at the bar, occupying the same stool he had been sitting on when Fish had left a couple of hours ago. "Hi, Fish," Craven said. "How's about another cup of coffee? Or are you on the wagon again?" Joe came back from waiting on one of the tables. "Hello, Fish," he said. "Have something on Craven?" He's got the zipper open on his weasel sack. Fish shook his head. "Just want to use your phone, Joe. Got a friend waiting for me outside." "Bring him in," suggested Craven. He and Joe turned their heads to look out through the glass at Fish's car. "What the heck, Fish?" Craven said. "That's..." "Name no names," Fish interrupted. "He's bashful. He'd rather stay out there." He took his notebook out of his vest pocket and flipped through it to find the number he intended to call, then walked back to the telephone before Craven could ask any more questions. It was a local toll call, to the sheriff of an outlying village 20 miles from town, a man who was a good friend of Fish's. The detective pitched his voice low so Craven would not hear the number or the message. "Hey, Fish," called Craven, as the detective replaced the receiver and started for the door. "Let us in on it." "What's up?" "Read about it in the Sentinel," Fish told him, and went on out and got back in the car. He had driven quite some distance when suddenly Whitman looked around with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "What the devil?" he demanded. "This isn't the way to the station." "That's right," Fish said gravely. "Guess I must be a bit lost. Well, we'll keep on and maybe we'll get to it." He swung the car into an arterial that led out of the city. "Listen, copper, there's a name for this. Kidnapping. And anyway, what's it all about? Save your breath for answering questions, when I ask them. You'll lose your job for this, Fish." Don't make me laugh. Unless I pull a rabbit out of a hat, I haven't got any job to lose. This is my last night, and I aim to have fun." "While you can still hide behind a badge, huh? Well, listen, if you retire tomorrow, you better pick a nice quiet island about 4,000 miles from." "Shut up," said Fish. He drove on in silence, out past the last diminishing buildings of the city's outskirts. 10 miles out he swung the car into a side road, from it to a dirt road that looked as though it led to nowhere. A mile up the dirt road he stopped. "End of the line," he said. "Get out. If you think you can get away with..." Fish put the heel of his palm in Whitman's face and pushed, hard. The gangster's head hit against the glass of the door with a thud. With his other hand, Fish reached across and yanked down the handle of the door. Whitman tumbled out of the car, barely managing to stay on his feet. He recovered his balance while Fish was climbing out after him, and started a swing at the detective's face. Fish caught the blow on his left forearm and then jumped down off the running board, adding the momentum of his descent to a short vicious right-hander that caught Whitman in the chest and sent him backward. He stumbled in the shallow ditch and fell. "And now," said Fish, "I'm not hiding behind any badge. This is strictly unofficial." He took the badge off the underside of his coat lapel and tossed it behind him onto the seat of the car. He took his automatic out of the shoulder holster and put it with the badge. "Try running," he said grimly, "and I'll pick up that gun again and shoot your legs from under. Otherwise it's even. Now get up." Hank Widner didn't. He gave vent to his feelings in some scorching remarks, but he didn't seem disposed to take advantage of Fish's being without his badge and gun. Fish grinned. "Don't get up, then," he said. "The Marquis of Queensbury isn't around here anyway, so he won't know it if I kick your teeth out. If you want to talk now instead of later, that's okay too. I'll give you 3 chances. 1. 2. Th. What do you want to know, blast you?" "That's better," said Fish. "Where's Carl Landers?" "Where's? Are you crazy? You're supposed to answer questions, not ask them. In case you didn't understand, we'll start over on those 3 chances. I asked you, where's Carl Landers? 1. 2. I don't know. Good glory, Fish, I never saw the guy. I never heard of him until I read he had escaped." Whitman, obviously cowed, was sitting up now, drawn back as far as he could get against the fence at the roadside. He seemed to see that his only chance to avoid a beating was to talk, and once he started, he talked fast. Listen, Fish, I've been in town only a year, so I didn't know about the Landers case when he was sent up. I mean, put in. What the devil makes you think I'd know anything about a homicidal? There you go asking questions again, interrupted Fish. All right, you answer it yourself. You know I have a reason for tying you up with Landers. You tell me what it could be. There isn't any reason, Fish. I don't know how, as he stepped closer and said, 1. How do you like the way I look with a cast on my nose? Funny? Well, you'll look funnier with one of these and your front teeth out. 2. Wait. You mean Mrs. Sanders? I might, Fish admitted. What about Mrs. Sanders? Oh, all right. I'll start at the beginning, but it's a mare's nest. It was this guy Landers killed them all right. Was it? Sure. You must have found out I talked to this Sanders dame and jumped to the idea that there was something fishy. Well, I had something of the same idea, but, well, it wouldn't wash. I decided I'd been seeing the bogeyman. Just what was this idea? You know well enough what I'm talking about. Forget what I know. You tell me. Well, it just seemed fishy that out of a whole city full of people, Bud Miller was the one who got bumped by a homie on the loose. It was a coincidence, that's all. But I wanted to make sure. How about Randall? Who? H.J. Randall. Oh, yeah, the grocer. No, there isn't any tie-up there. That's partly what made me decide the homie angle was on tie-up and up. Fish looked at him closely. That and what else? He demanded. Oh, all of it. Your story, the way the papers gave it, and Craven's and Hummer's and, well, it all added up. It couldn't have been anything but the loose nut, could it? You and Hummer both got a good look at him. Wasn't it this Landers? Fish ignored the question. You thought it might not be. Who did you think might have killed Bud Miller? You knew him pretty well, didn't you? Whitman nodded. He was talking freely now, as though having kicked loose with what he had already said, he had nothing further to hide and was even interested in finding out if Fish knew anything. Yeah, Bud Miller and me, well, I guess I was his closest friend. We worked together on whatever we worked on. Fish grinned at the circumlocution. You mean on carrying out whatever orders the boss gave you, he said. We'll skip that. But did anyone have any reason for wanting Bud out of the way? No. Whitman shook his head, then hesitated. Well, I've gone this far and I might as well say that there might have been a reason I didn't know about. I had a hunch, for the last couple weeks, that Bud was holding out something on me. And he had a new dame. What's her name? Marilyn Breeze. A pony at the truck. But she wouldn't have anything to do with it, Fish. All I meant about her was that she was costing him plenty dough. And he had it. That isn't squealing because, what the heck, he's dead. You mean you think he had more money the last couple weeks than he should have had, from sources you knew about? That's it. I dunno where he got it, and it don't matter now. But then when he got killed, well, it was silly I guess, but I thought maybe. So you turned detective and conducted an investigation on your own hook. Cranston know about your little idea? Hank Whitman shook his head again. And listen, if it gets out about me talking to Mrs. S., I'm going to have to do some tall explaining to the boss. He'll want to know why I didn't come to him with it. And why didn't you? Well, look, Fish, you got some idea what things are all about. Suppose Bud had crossed the boss. Suppose it wasn't this Landers bumped him. Who would be the next most likely guy? And would the boss like to have me doing any guessing out loud? I ask you. Fish thought it over a minute. It was disappointing. He'd hoped for more, something that would give him a definite lead. But what Hank Whitman had just told him made sense and it rang true. Apparently he and Hank had had the same idea. It had led Hank to a brick wall, and Fish didn't see how he was going to get over that wall himself. If Carl Landers really had killed the gangster and the grocer, then that was that. Curse it all, he didn't have any real reason to think anything else had happened. But that had been over 24 hours ago. Why hadn't the homicidal maniac struck again? According to his case history, he would not be sitting quietly in hiding, waiting for them to catch him. He was an extreme case, obsessed with an insatiable urge to slash people with a knife. And he had a knife now. Why wasn't he using it? Or did he have a knife? Had he ever had one, that is, since his escape? Or had he escaped? Nuts, thought Fish. Pretty soon I'll be wondering if there ever was such a guy and if I really tried to buy him a drink. Whitman's voice cut into his thoughts. Honest, Fish, that's all I can tell you. The whole story. Now what the devil can I tell Cranston about what you wanted with me, that won't spill to him that I had a wrong hunch that might not set so well with him? Tell him anything, said Fish. Maybe by tomorrow you won't have to tell him anything. Skip it. What was that notebook you handed Cranston? Whitman's voice sounded wary. What notebook? Fish took his own notebook from his pocket, the one he had carried for a long time to jot down addresses. One like this, he said. Almost exactly like it. That refresh your memory, or do I have to get tough again? Oh, that, said Whitman. Yeah. That couldn't have anything to do with this other business. Just routine. A list of addresses. You can guess what for, without my drawing a diagram. You mean a list of the taverns that buy alky? Whiskey, corrected Whitman. If you can call it that. If you had that list, it means you were handling either deliveries or collections, you and Bud, if he worked with you. Which? Listen, Fish, haven't I sung enough? And since when are you going in for revenue work? The devil with the revenue work, for now, said Fish. Why'd you think I brought you out here instead of taking you in where a shorthander'd be taking down what you said? All I'm interested in right now is murder. Anything else is off the record, and anyway it would be your word against mine whether you said it or not. But what's this stuff got to do with murder? Let me judge that. Which were you and Bud handling? Deliveries, or collections? Okay, but it's off the record. 50-50. We collected for whatever we delivered. That's why one don't see how Bud could have been chiseling. Not without being caught. Maybe he was caught. Whitman had stood up and was leaning against the fence now. Aw, Fish, there's nothing in it, he said. I tell you I had the same idea, but it won't wash. Assume he was chiseling, even if I can't see how. Give anybody you want to name all the reason you want to give him for rubbing him out. It's still true that he got bumped off by a maniac. The nut was there, wasn't he? You ought to know. He swipes a knife from Joe's kitchen and runs out the back way and stabs the first couple guys he comes across. What else can you make out of it? Fish grunted. Shut up, or you'll have me believing it. Don't you? I don't want to, said Fish. Get in the car. I might be wrong, but I think you leveled with me. Okay. But listen, what am I going to tell the boss about why you picked on me, without admitting about me having the wild idea I had and seeing Mrs. Sanders? Fish slid his automatic back into its holster and put the badge back on before he slid in under the wheel. You're going to have time to figure that out before you see him again, he said. I got you fixed up for board and room till tomorrow afternoon. I want to find out what Cranston does if he gets worried about you. Huh? You can't. It's strictly legal. He's a sheriff, see? There's nothing illegal, if he finds you on the street in his town, about arresting you as a vag, is there? I don't think you'll have any explanation he'll believe about how you got there. But Fish. And of course you won't have any money or identification on you when you get out of the car. Fish grinned. But don't let that worry you, pal. I'll mail them back to you sometime tomorrow. Chapter 6. Fish dropped himself on the stool by the hamburger stand counter. Hi, Pete, he said to the tow-headed kid back of the counter. Put a couple on, with. And coffee. Sure, Mr. Fish, said the kid, and then, hesitantly. I read about the Carl Landers case. You sure had tough luck, Mr. Fish. Has anything more happened since then? Fish shook his head tiredly. Had what I thought was a lead, but it petered out on me. He glanced up at the clock. 10 minutes after 1. He stirred sugar into his coffee, took a sip, and it made him feel a little better. But not much. He was getting sleepy and his nose and his head hurt and he wished he could go home and go to sleep. It would not be so bad, he thought disgustedly, trying to solve a case if he could feel sure there was a case to solve. But in all probability there wasn't any. Carl Landers had committed the 2 motiveless murders, then lambed out across country and, for reasons of his own, had not killed anybody else yet. Or maybe he had been hit by a truck and not yet identified or something. Or maybe, nuts. He had bed himself in circles until he was dizzy. And he had undoubtedly increased the jam he was in at headquarters by making an arrest after Cap Bradwell had told him he was suspended, even though the captain had not taken his gun and badge along, and then not showing up with the man he had arrested. He wondered if Cranston's lawyer was still waiting at the station. Pete, he said, murder is a funny thing. If you haven't the faintest idea what you're doing, you can always go around throwing monkey wrenches, and maybe you can get somebody worried. The tow-headed kid put the hamburgers on the counter in front of Fish, and looked interested. Yeah? He asked. How? Murder is a guinea pig, said Fish. It has pups, or piglets or whatever you'd call it. A guy commits a murder and then he finds he had to kill somebody else to cover up. Maybe the second guy might be a grocer. Then if you can keep it rolling, he'd think, whether he's right or not, that he has to kill another guy to keep it quiet. Maybe a detective. Gee, you mean you think that? No, but I wish I did. The door opened and Fish looked around as two men came in. Hello, boys, he said. Anything new on shortwave about Landers? The foremost of the two men shook his head. But listen, Fish, there's a broadcast out about you. We saw your car outside. The cap says you're supposed to be suspended but that you pulled an arrest at the Green Dragon, and then never showed up with the guy. A lawyer waited there a long time. Yeah, said Fish. That's why I didn't bring him in. I just wanted to talk to him. Got orders to bring me in, Harry, or what? Harry Lane looked uncomfortable. Well, suppose you call up the station from here, Fish. See what the cap says. I don't want to. Okay, anything you say, said Fish. He crossed over to the phone and talked into it for a while. His lips were a bit tight as he came back and, before he sat down again to finish his sandwiches, he took off his badge and handed it, with his gun, to the squad car men. It's okay, he told them. You don't have to take me in. But the cap seemed to think I'd better not run around with these until after the hearing tomorrow morning anyway. Gee, Fish, that's tough luck. I'm sorry. It's all right, Harry. Skip it. While he munched the hamburgers, Fish heard the squad car start up and drive away. He didn't say anything more to the tow-headed kid behind the counter, and the kid had wisdom enough to keep his own mouth shut. When Fish got back behind the wheel of his own car, he sat there and thought a while he unlaced the empty shoulder holster which, without a gun, made him feel strange and lopsided. He knew he was licked, but darned if he was going to admit it, in spite of how tired he felt. He had gambled on practically kidnapping Hank Whitman, partly to see what Cranston's reaction would be. Well, Whitman had, in a way, disappointed him by telling what seemed to be a straight story. So it looked like he had been barking up the wrong tree, but he was going back to the Green Dragon anyway. He was going back without a gun and without authority, but Cranston wouldn't know that. He drove slowly, trying to think out some course of action that might force, blast it, was he still hunting in the dark for a black cat that wasn't there? Well, what if he was? He hadn't anything much to lose now. And he had the rest of the night to keep on groping. The familiar streets grew more familiar and he saw that his route across town was taking him within a block of his own place. Well, he might as well take advantage of that to leave the billfold he had taken from Hank Whitman in a safe place. There had been quite a bit of money in that wallet, and he would rather not carry it around until he had a chance to mail it. And a bit of cold water on the accessible portions of his face ought to help wake him up and make his mind work again. A shower? No, he had better not take time for that. It was getting pretty late. If only his nose would stop throbbing, he swung the car into the curb and climbed out. He told himself he had better hurry, but his steps up the staircase were slow and lagging. He fumbled the key, had a lot of trouble getting it into the keyhole in the dark, so much trouble that he lit a match and held it in his left hand while he put in the key and turned it with his right. The tiny flame was dying as the door swung open toward him, but it showed him the shadowy, unidentifiable bulk of the man standing there just inside the door. And it caught the gleam of the knife that slashed out toward Fish's stomach. A kitchen knife. It was that gleam of dim flame on dull metal that saved him. Fish still had hold of the door with his right hand and he slammed it inward so the edge of it struck the arm snaking forward with the knife. The impact slowed and deflected the blow, and as the door bounded back, Fish grabbed into the darkness and caught the arm of his attacker. He threw his weight through the now open doorway, bearing his assailant back, even as he felt the arm he held trying to twist about for a stabbing blow into his side. He had his cheek against his opponent's chest, and there were blows raining 54 against his head and neck. Painful blows, but not dangerous. In the reeling darkness and the close quarters, the man he struggled with could not have aim or leverage for a rabbit punch that might have ended the fight. As he staggered forward, not daring to step back, Fish slid his left hand down until it closed around the wrist of the knife hand. Then, risking letting go with his own right hand, he bent lower and caught his right arm around the back of the knees of the man he fought, and threw his own weight forward, butting with his head. There was a moment when they were both off balance, then a heavy crash, and Fish fell on top. The knife clattered against the floor. Fish felt the man under him struggling to rise, but instead of swinging a random blow into the darkness, Fish stuck out his hand until it fell to face. He pushed the face backward, hard and suddenly, and there was a thud against the floor. The man under him went limp. Fish straightened up slowly, and struck a match. "I'll be," he said, as it flared. The man who had tried to kill him was Joe Hummer, the barkeeper. It was some little time before Hummer regained consciousness, and when he did he was in no position to fight or to wield a knife. Fish had seen to that. Nor was the barkeeper inclined to answer questions. "Like sin I'll talk," he growled to Fish's repeated demands. "Why should I? So you can prove I tried to kill you, and that's bad enough, but why should I stick my neck?" "Shut up," said Fish. "I'm telling you why. But first I'm going to finish telling you what happened. When I came into the saloon last night with an escaped homicidal maniac in tow, you recognized him, or guessed who he was, from the descriptions or maybe his picture in the newspaper. And you suddenly saw how you could get away with killing a guy you had to kill, Bud Miller." "Nuts," said Joe. "And even if you did guess right." "I said to shut up," said Fish. He gestured with the old service revolver he had dug up out of a trunk while Joe Hummer was still unconscious, and Joe sank back into the chair. The reason the feds hadn't closed on the Cranston bunch was that they didn't know where the accounts and collections were handled. Cranston never had any records. They had searched, unofficially. You were the dark horse of the gang, and probably next to Cranston himself in power. We'll find out all about that when we search your place, won't we, Joe? All right, but you'd been dragging down on the boss and Bud Miller found it out and cut himself in on the deal for extra cash. And he started bleeding you worse and you wanted a way to kill him. If you could do it in a way that not even Cranston, let alone the cops, would know he was murdered at all. Nobody figures a killing by a maniac as a murder, the ordinary way, Joe sighed. "Fish, do I have to listen to all this hogwash? If I'm under arrest, go ahead and take me in." "You're not under arrest. I'm not even a cop anymore. Listen. Bud Miller was in the part of your building behind the kitchen, waiting to see you. You saw your chance in Carl Landers. When you took him back to feed him, you stepped out a minute to see whether he would go for a knife. You wanted to be sure who he was. Then you captured him. You went on back and stalled Bud Miller, walked with him out into the alley, and stabbed him with the knife Landers had tried to swipe. 55. This poor grocer, Randall, is going or coming the back way, and he'd have been a witness, so you stabbed him too. But that was all to the good. 2 killings looked more like a homicidal maniac than one. And you were back in the tavern within 10 minutes, and you figured I was too interested in my drinks to know you'd been gone even that long." Fish grinned. "The funny part is that I never guy," he said. "I was just saw that notebook of mine I got a phone number out of and you thought it was Whitman's and that I knew about your connection with the gang. Well, either pick up that pen and start writing or we're on our way." Joe Hummer stood up. "Let's get going then." "Okay, Joe. But not to headquarters. I told you I'm not a cop anymore. We're looking up Cranston and I'm turning you over to him with the news that you killed Bud Miller and have been chiseling on him. I'll telling around tonight at random, trying to start something, and in some way you got the idea that I was getting on to you and that you'd better get out of the road. But you came here to kill me, and then you'd have let Landers go and let him get himself caught somewhere and take the rap for all 3 killings, besides any he might do on his own hook. But what made you think, hey, I know? You knew I had Hank Whitman out in my car when I stopped back and Fish laughed out loud and slapped his knees with the hand that didn't hold the revolver. You him to go to your place and search there and, well, he won't need a confession like the cops would he?" Hummer's face turned pasty white. "You're kidding, Fish. You wouldn't do that." Fish's eyes, over the bandage across the middle of his face, looked to be the color and hardness of ball bearings. Joe Hummer sat back slowly and gingerly in the chair, and reached for the pen and paper on the table beside him. Gray light of dawn paled the Yell 56 low aura of the lamp on Captain Bradwell's desk. Fish slumped wearily in the visitor's chair in front of that desk and talked as though each word cost him an effort. "Yeah, so I went around and got Carl Landers, too, so I could bring them both in while I was at it. But, you see, he didn't commit the murders at all. He was tied up in the empty building next to Joe's. And, like I told you, Hank Whitman's in the clink at Shelbyville. We can send for him there. I think that confession, and what else we'll find at Joe's, will give us enough to break up the whole gang. I'd have gone around and brought in Cranston too, but," Captain Bradwell snorted. But you thought you might want help to round up the rest of the gang? Fish must have been too tired to recognize the sarcasm. Well, there's no hurry, he said defensively. They don't know we want 'em, or that Joe's confession they're tied up the gang with those old killings, including Mollenhauer's. They don't know we got Joe, and they'll be easy to pick up. Captain Bradwell grinned and winked at the stenographer at the side of his desk who was taking notes of everything. I guess the rest of the force can manage to take over from here, Fish, he said. Unless you really want. I can, Cap, but I really ought to get a couple hours nap before that hearing at 10. Hearing? What hearing? Oh, yeah. I don't think you need to worry about attending that, Fish. I haven't quite the authority to squash it myself, but I can promise you Tile Inspector will. And listen, Wimp Mock really done in. I have got authority to give you another VBK's leave. You better go home and EP a couple days straight, and then, he grinned, then maybe you ought to go out and get plastered to celebrate. Fish stood up. Thanks, Cap, he said, and stuck out his hand. But if it's the same to you, I'll go fishing. Goodnight. Captain Bradwell watched Fish's broad shoulders weave down the hallway, as erratically as though liquor instead of lack of sleep and physical weariness were swaying him. If we had more men like that on the force, he said to the stenographer. We wouldn't need a force. The stenographer looked at him. That doesn't quite make sense, sir. No, said the captain, grinning. It doesn't, does it? Ready for another Fish Williams adventure? Check out Rack and Ruin.